I keep having to pull it repeatedly, and it's just exciting.
All right. Well, welcome everybody back to the weekly Dalten Collective, and today we have Ed with us. Ed is like our lead designer at Talon, who is sort of the brainchild behind a lot of what you see in Urbit, which is in this case landscape, or most likely what you see. There's other interfaces too, and I'm sure we'll go into that. But Ed, welcome to this week's Hangout, and yeah, go ahead, please introduce yourself. Put anything in there that I forgot.
Yeah, hi. It's nice to meet all of you, or to provide a face to all of you who are watching this. Like it was mentioned, my name is Ed. And I think the best way to give an introduction isn't really to go too deep into it. I mean, um, I basically entered in the sort of general design field as like a physical product designer. And the only reason I mention that is because that actually serves as a nice sort of like backing to how I think about even sort of digital designing, like interface designing and all of that. Um, so yeah, I come from a kind of weird and crazy path of learning to do software design, just in a lot of different contexts, small and big, corporate and non-corporate, or just sort of self-derived. And I was taken by Urbit in around 2015. I say taken as if I was abducted, but that was when I discovered it, more or less. And I was still working at a very large corporation at the time. And I just remember being struck by its sort of beauty that it kind of exuded. The way that I typically like to describe it to a lot of people is that I kind of like envisioned in my mind this solid block of brass or marble. And back then the website was primitive. It was all still command line interface. That's actually where I met Palfan and a number of other people, including Galen, um, in the chat, and it was just a good time, ever since then. So yeah, Urbit has been kind of a long object of fascination, and it kind of like ended up fueling a lot of my own interest in just what new computers were, or this idea that I think it's well understood by people who work in technology, who at least have some notion of its history, that computers as we know them haven't really changed since the 70s, really. Some would argue even that fundamentally what we're using is still like of the 40s and 50s. Everything still is kind of a long train of evolution from those initial war machines, the things that we use to kind of track missile trajectories. And so in a way, you can see a lot of what Urbit is as sort of taking that timeline and in a way like rejecting it, or at least saying, well, what is it like for a more kind of people scoped or human sized computer internet to spring forth from the ones and zeros. That was less of a background, I realized, more of just a sort of unfolding of just like my own involvement in Urbit. But that's kind of like where I kind of have introduced myself in the project at least.
All right. So let's first talk about landscape. What is it, and how does it fit into what you just described about Urbit?
Yeah, landscape is interesting. So I think I had formally joined Tlon in a full-time capacity around a year or so ago. I think it's a year and a few months at this point. And around that time, there was a working user interface that was called Modulo at the time. I believe, and I would have to get corrected on this possibly, but Modulo from this idea that it was like a modular interface. It had these things that we called modules, which we still call modules, called chat and publish. I think at that time links didn't exist. The clock was still there at that time. And the idea was that you would have what was effectively a blank slate for you to take these bits of functionality and just rearrange them as you saw fit as a set of tiles on the screen. When we look at what landscape is now, and what we will be presenting on Friday, actually, there's this really distinct transformation from this idea of a module-based function sort of oriented interface to something that is revolving around the idea of what a group is. So the idea is that when I access my computer, at least in the landscape definition of what the Urbit computer is, the first thing you see isn't functionality. The first thing you see are people or groups of people or groups of associations that represent groups of people. So it's kind of like a nice transformation that we had actually been scheming around, you know, around like a year ago, even like around the time I had joined, we had started discussions as to like, well, how would we like transition this modulo interface into something that was a little bit more oriented around the notion of a community or a group of people. At that time, although we did describe and still do describe Urbit as the only personal computer left in the world, personal meaning of the self and related to the self. I think we all acknowledge that the sort of primary use of computers is with other people. At their heart, they're almost communication devices, in a way. At least how they are used by the vast majority of people out in the world. So Landscape now, as a sort of interface, as a total interface, can almost be seen as a lattice for you to sort of insert groups upon and relate between them. And then within that group, be able to sort of surface up the ability to actually directly communicate with people, to write with other people, to share links with other people. And the way that I've been recently terming that is almost as like similar to how one might have pants and a shirt as a basic piece of clothing or a basic garment. We can almost see a lot of what the aim of Landscape is to function as a digital basics of sort. On a computer, I expect to be able to write and to type things in with a keyboard or with my thumbs. I expect to be able to view, quote unquote content, whatever the fuck content is. And excuse my language, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to curse here.
Yeah, you
but
can.
media, whatever. It's like people expect to be able to see things. I would like to see an image. I would like to see a link or a video. I would like to see a book, possibly. So the definition of media there is quite large, as we all know. So I'd like to be able to just view the basic building blocks of human knowledge and to chat with people and to write and all these other basic actions. So I think our main thesis behind Landscape is to satisfy this condition of being a place where people can build communities or assemble them how they see fit, and to be able to partake in the sort of digital basics that one expects to be able to do on a computer. Apart from that, I think to even set the bounding box of what Landscape can be, we have to, I think, really emphasize for those who aren't aware that Landscape is really just one means or one mechanism of using the computer that is Urbit, the general purpose computer that really doesn't care what you're doing with it. There's been a lot of amazing talk on Urbit community recently about other clients that could crop up in the near future that some people are interested in building right this moment. You can imagine clients that are only oriented towards the digital basic action of chatting. And I believe we have a Swift-based application for iOS that does just that. It just lets you chat, that's all. But this thing is almost its own client in a way. There's this idea that has been floating around about building something of like a Steam client, like a sort of central location for the organization of games that exists in the world, but for a world based in Urbit, this could be like a place where you would have all of your P2P games located. And that could be a client purely dedicated to that without the ability to read things or to chat with people. It could be very focused towards that act of building a digital library, so to speak. So Landscape is really meant to afford for what I see as utilities, where we would love to see the sort of proliferation of clients that do a lot more interesting or rich or weird things in the future, or just done by the community right now even.
And so you described Landscape as a client. I've sometimes heard of it as an application, as a product, but I've also heard of things like Arvo described as something like an operating system. And when I think of Landscape, it feels to me like an interface, which a lot of times what an operating system feels like. How is this kind of the same and different from what we sort of see currently from a computer and its operating system and the applications that run on top of it?
That's actually a really good question. And it's actually one that I would love to even have a dialogue or have someone else answer to, because I think at the moment, my understanding of this is admittedly quite shallow. I tend to kind of intentionally wall myself off from deeper knowledge just so I can remain as focused as I can on more immediate concerns. But I think the description is more or less apt. What we have at the heart of Urbit itself, the actual computer, is this thing called Arvo, which is effectively the operating system, as people call it. It's a thing that kind of manages, how information is being relayed across the greater computer. And I am heavily ad-libbing this, and I know our other devs on the stream may be grinding their teeth at me, but for anyone who's like kind of new to computers in the audience, this is more or less what it does. It's that little core nugget in your system that does a lot of that handling. And in a similar way, for the people who are familiar with Linux, for example, you have this notion of GNU Linux, this idea of a kernel for an operating system, but we have all of these other sort of distributions like Ubuntu, like Red Hat, I believe is, I think that is an equivalent distribution. You just have all of these distributions that have the same core at the heart of them. And what we can imagine as landscape is almost a distribution in the sense that it's this sort of user land or a shell that is based around the actual core computer, that sort of like little nugget of computation that's occurring. But I think the sort of differentiation here is that landscape isn't necessarily, I think the thing about distributions that someone who actually uses Linux full time would have to maybe expand upon, but there's this notion that there is a lot of logic that may interoperate with that core that is the computer that is specific only to that that distribution. I can't really think of a good one-to-one example right now, and I wouldn't want to pretend that I do, but I do get the sense that certain distributions that still do use Linux, like Arch Linux is one example that deviates quite a lot from Debian or from Ubuntu, which those two come from the same root. I think that they do have their own specific logics that are really independent of that actual distribution. So you actually see quite a bit of a heavy distinction between distributions where for Arch Linux, for example, it has its own package management system, its own norms that are associated with that. And for Debian and Debian-based distributions like Ubuntu, they have their own mechanism of handling packages and software distribution that is a little bit branched off from for those two root distributions. I think that as it stands right now, you can't really at all call a comparison between what landscape is and what a distribution of Linux is, because there's just a lot more meaning, I think, embedded into the idea of what a distribution is that makes that whole concept a lot more specific. The word client, I think, is still probably the best descriptor of what landscape is, in the sense that it really is just this shell of sorts that communicates with the nugget of the computer, like the core of it that I think we still retain as a point of comparison. But the comparison I would suppose with Linux is a little bit more different than that. This is one of those things where I would love to like kind of totally just push that off on someone else to answer. I think someone could do that way more accurately, but I hope that was more or less an okay comparison.
Yeah. So let's talk about aesthetics. Urbit has been described as a project steeped in aesthetics and has a very strong point of view when it comes to what is beautiful and how to present things visually. So with that kind of background coming into it, how do you think about aesthetics and what is beautiful in terms of an interface?
Yeah, I mean, that actually is a good question. It's quite deep, actually. I feel like that could take up a lot of time. But in the interest of possibly offering a brief description of that, it helps to, I guess, see where I come from in terms of my own parsing of like what good aesthetics are, which are obviously vastly differentiated between people. This actually does relate to the sort of core of a lot of my own design education and just where I come from in terms of design, in the sense that in the world of physical product design, there was a bit of a movement that was quite, I don't even know if you could call it popular, but it was at least something that people thought was a big deal back in the 90s or the early 2000s, I believe, called super normal. And this wasn't a philosophy, really. You can't really call it that. It wasn't anything particularly deep. But the whole point of sort of the super normal mode of thinking about aesthetics or what good design was that it was a sort of admission that you have these objects that totally fit perfectly within the context in which they're situated. Something like a traffic cone, the bright orange cones, they fit really well in the context of a city, but the moment you place something like that into the countryside, for example, it would look very, very, very out of place. It would look completely unnatural to put there. And there's this admission that there are many strains of what one could consider minimalist or simple design, but at the sort of core of what minimalism is, it's in fact like something that doesn't fit well in a lot of contexts. You could have this beautifully minimalist work of physical product design, and when you situate it into a rustic house or into like a yurt or something, it would look completely out of place. It would look ridiculous to try to situate an object of minimalist design or Swiss or like high Swiss or Japanese or German or whatever sort of design, whatever sort of you would associate with that, into a context in which it doesn't make sense. You have this vast disjointing between the sort of context of place and just the sort of culture around that, and the attempt to inject a minimal design into it. So I say all of this because, in a way, that was a sort of my sort of overriding thought about aesthetics, was that you can't really necessarily invent a notion of simplicity and hope to inject it into whatever context you can. You almost have to take root, or like sort of take notice of where you're situated, and then try to kind of design a normal object around that. What would then be called the supernormal object is something that fits perfectly into its context such that it almost becomes invisible. It's something that kind of just almost fades into the background and becomes just another aspect of the environment. And in a way, I think that if you were to ask the three or the two other designers on Urbit, or on Tlon, I should say, not including Galen, if you were to ask them, they probably all have their own specific thoughts around what exactly good design is or what good aesthetics are. So I have to make it very clear that this is very subjective. But I do get the sense that in designing landscape, you could almost say that there was a very similarly sort of structured approach to it, where the idea was to not create something in landscape that was minimal for minimalism's sake or simple for simplicity's sake. There was this idea to take what is um, almost close to just sort of barren or just very simple structures in terms of just, well, we didn't want to really go overboard with the visual styling of a lot of our landscape, I should say, but we made instances sort of very expressive. In the case of the clock, I think is everyone's favorite example. There was this idea to kind of like inject very specific meaning into particular parts that we thought deserved that, but the overall thing is meant to be like this hyper simple expression of minimalism. It was all meant to sort of incorporate a lot of the patterns that people are used to, with chat being the great example, the example that everyone will see unveiled on Friday. There's this idea that we borrowed a lot of the norms associated with things like Slack or things like Discord. This idea that you have a left-aligned sort of structure of channels or communication mediums, and you had a viewing surface off to the right. There's a sort of a meme out in software development land where it's like, oh, you want to be special, you want to differentiate heavily, but there are patterns that people basically take for a given at this point in the way that styling interfaces has existed for the last couple of decades or so. And we're not making any intentional mean to really heavily break away from this at the present moment. I think that we do have ideas for what really special, unique interfaces could be that emanate very specifically from Urbit's context. But for things like chat, for things like a forum, for things like browsing links, for example, we don't want to do anything too wild with that, because it would seem out of place to try to reinvent the wheel, so to speak.
And so just kind of riffing off of your concept of context
Mm-hmm.
and the point that Urbit is a virtual machine. So it's not constrained by any kind of hardware, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
What are the kind of hardware setups that you envision of affording this sort of minimalist design to really shine and to really become part and integrated? What might we see in the next several years as Urbit moves into hardware?
That's a very good question. An idea that I've always thought as being particularly fun would be to kind of take the approach of designing a computer without a screen and really go deep into what would be like very possible with that. There's this overriding thought that we could almost build small totems that can maybe plug themselves into a wall or into monitors, and they would be this portable device that would effectively have one's Urbit able to be manifested in any device really that one could imagine. I think that they do, and they have designed or built dongle computers, these things that you could plug into a monitor and have immediately available as soon as it hits a wireless network that you can use to access the internet and do whatever you'd like. And I feel like that has only been lightly explored, and it could be fun to see how that could be delved into much deeper. I think with respect to Urbit 2, there isn't exactly yet a sort of pure P2P story, in the sense that if I have my device here and it's completely off the internet and there was someone else with a laptop right next to me, there currently is no way for those two ships to speak to one another on a local network. But I would love for that exploration to kind of come to bear in the near future. It would be amazing for me to be able to set up a small little device and have it be like in a convention hall or what have you, and be able to have a sort of very local mesh network with only Urbit identities able to access it. I think any sort of hardware that could accelerate that type of vision for a sort of self-owned internet that doesn't have to rely on existing infrastructure in the world, that could be incredibly cool. And it could be a nice sort of at least a directional base to create hardware based off of.
Very cool. And so you mentioned earlier that the next iteration of landscape, which is going to be sort of on display on Friday here at an event, a meetup, a virtual event, it's going to be really focused on groups and group interactions and communications.
Totally.
So something I know that people have been talking about for a long time have been wanting, but there's just been so much talk about how to do it right, is
Mhm.
notifications. So
Yes,
walk us
yes.
through your thinking on notifications, without giving too much away, but like what should we be sort of expecting here?
Yeah, well, the best way to summarize that is that we don't want to overthink it. It's far too easy for a lot of notification systems, as I think a lot of people have encountered, for them to be quite overbearing in terms of tuning how they work. And the way that we have generally thought about notifications in almost the highest level is that, contrary to a lot of other experiences out there, we actually are taking a very stark approach in that we we would hope, and I think that this will be in fact the case. So I think I can make this claim without having to backtrack at any point, that we will be making notifications purely opt-in, as a sort of maximalist stance. Even like, you can imagine, okay, it's easy to say that, but if we were to develop an Urbit laptop tomorrow, I would be in the position to want to enforce the fact that you don't even receive notification that your battery is about to die. If your hardware battery was about to die, or you don't receive notifications if your device has found a new Wi-Fi network. I think that this immediately poses a few questions as to, well, then how, as a new user or someone who is completely new to this way of thinking about notifications, how do I set notifications? And so, as a part of this stance, I would imagine that one of the affordances that we would like to explore in all of the interfaces in landscape would be to basically very strategically situate little prompts for how to possibly opt into notifications. One of the ways that we can exemplify this is that in the new landscape design, you have this idea of a group. You have now a sidebar full of channels. And when I click into that channel, I don't automatically join it. I see almost a small welcome banner that says, hey, this is the name of the channel, this is the description of it. And then a third bit of information here could be, would you like to opt into notifications for this channel? And it's unchecked by default. So what you would have to do as a user is say, yes, I would like to receive notifications on this channel. I then press, I'd like to join the channel, or and then at that point you would receive notifications for that channel. So this sounds simple, I think, with the channel example. But as you get into a world where it's like, I would like to receive notifications based on direct messages, or in a world where we do run on hardware, I would like to receive notifications of my battery status or what available networks there are in the vicinity. This gets into a little bit more of a thinking around how the mechanics around introducing notifications work, rather than notifications themselves. Because I think we'd all agree that notifications don't need to be fancy. It just needs to be a little string that tells me what's going on. It needs to basically expand my awareness of what the system is doing in a way that kind of respects where I'd like my awareness to be located. I don't want to have to be pinged every time a channel I don't care at all about is messaging me, or having updates sent to it. So making sure that we respect this mechanic and this overall stance of opt notifications as a very sort of pure approach, I think, is going to be the major thing to think around as we evolve it. The first stab at this will be very simple, though, and does directly relate to the channels case that I just outlined.
Nice. And maybe even, as you mentioned earlier, different clients might handle this in different ways.
Exactly. Yes, that is true.
Or like you said, a very simple app on your phone might do certain kinds of notifications, and like your battery, you don't want your phone ringing if your battery's, yeah, makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, I would say that this stance really does sort of emanate mostly from Tlon's own expression in landscape as to what an Urbit client could be. But the admission to make here is that depending on what clients are unlocked through Airlock, whether they're developed on iOS or Android, or various Linux distributions, there will have to be a contending there with the way that native notifications are handled, and we may not be able to enforce that as like an Urbit point of view, but we can at least offer up a stance of what we do believe a good interface should be.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to open it up to the rest of the group here. Go ahead and please ask Ed any questions you'd like.
I really enjoy hearing you talk about this design element. I'm not a very artistic person, so it's sort of out of my vocabulary, but I like, now I'm looking at super normal on my other screen and trying to follow you through this conversation. So that's very helpful, and thank you for doing that. I have a question about how you might see professional work happening on Urbit at some point in the future. What would that look like?
No, that's a wonderful question. There's the I think that what's interesting about that question is that there could be possibly like a branching of how one would distinguish like professional work, in the sense that I can imagine there being maybe more passive sort of means of enacting in professional work, where it's like, I'm an author, I've written a book, and now the book is just lying there as this sort of dormant object that I can then sell to people. So there's that sort of realm where it's like, I've done the work and now I have produced a given crystallization of labor that I can then sell to people. I think this is you can, authors are a great example, musicians are another great example, where they have their crystallized labor in the form of an album, for example. And there are a good many other sort of cases in which you have a thing you've already done and you'd like to sell quantities of it, whether they're limited or unlimited in the form of digital goods or what have you. And then, of course, there's the completely other realm, which of sort of more active or more sort of actively engaged professional work, which is actually where it gets interesting, because we have this entire realm of streamers. I think the whole realm of even like esports, I think, is like a perfect example of this recent form of labor that is like deeply active, and it's kind of like in the actual like in the throes of it really is when the sort of actual exchange is happening. You're watching someone play this insane game in real time, making scoring or what have you, and being able to kind of like actively engage in that. And that's where you get the sort of streamer culture. You see a lot of Twitch, I think, making a lot of headway in that realm with their monetization of, like, I don't even know what they call them, like bits or something, where you can like send small micropayments over to the streamer. I think that even another good example that that comes to mind is a lot of these new networks, such I think Twitch is one. It's operating based on the idea of micropayments in the form of BSV. There's a couple of other like Ethereum-based ones that, or they use some other sort of small coin of some sort and micropayments to basically enact a very active system of being able to pay people based on liking them or the equivalent of retweeting them or whatever. And then you also you see a weird sort of hybrid of these two approaches between the passive and active, and then things like Patreon, which is almost like an ongoing payment for the promise of possible passive generation of like crystallized labor or like active engagement with the actual the creator in mind. And in each of these sort of three structures that they're all, you could really argue about the precision of these at any time, but I get the sense that one of the more near-term affordances that Urbit as a sort of network, or landscape specifically, I need to remind myself that we're talking really about landscape here, is this idea that one could produce something that is like a crystallized moment of their work in the form of writing or blogging, possibly, or if we were to adapt publish towards the hosting of music or audio-based work, someone could use publish as like a pseudo SoundCloud or Bandcamp even, which are both platforms for the streaming of music. The idea is that one could, using some payment mechanism, almost gate off those nodes, such that when I sort of visit this ship's publish blog, I see a post and it's like, hey, you need to pay me 0.001 Ethereum to view this bit of music. They could be able to do that. And I think this is a project that is actively being worked on now. It actually had gotten a lot of headway a couple of months ago, but because it was effectively a developer tool, it wasn't something that was released to sort of the greater public to use. But I do know that getting payments situated as a gating mechanism for arbitrary nodes based on our graph store infrastructure, which we could get into that later, you can look it up. The idea would be to have a very arbitrary set of nodes on a graph that could be gated depending on whether the user wants to or not. So I think what we can lean to or expect to lean into in the very near future is being able to take that more passive sort of professional labor style, where I have a given thing, a given unit of information, I could then just gate it off, with payments accordingly. And we would have like you would hope that we would have an associated wallet and mechanism of payment around that time. But that's the one that I can see really being developed in the more near term. Things like Patreons or Substacks on Urbit, I think, are also, they've been in constant discussion, not just in Talon itself, but in the community about how to build that. The question of active professional work is really interesting, and one that I don't think I've heard very much discussion around. But imagining streaming on Urbit is, of course, very tantalizing. It's very cool to think about.
Is it scary at all for you to think about like because Twitch displays are very active and very, I don't know, overwhelming at times. Does having something like, does the tendency for that to be the method of engagement because it creates more engagement worry you at all in terms of how Urbit's going to develop, how Landscape's going to develop?
I guess I have less to say on the Urbit front of things, since that truly is it's beyond the realm of Talon at the moment. You know, I wouldn't be surprised at all if in the next year or so another client crops up that maybe is more aligned to sort of like dopamine mining as we're all used to in the current web. But I think as far as Landscape is concerned, I wouldn't even necessarily say that the enacting of streaming and active communication in the style of Twitch streaming is necessarily antithetical to what we're building here, because when we talk about building a calm computer or a calm interface, I think what we're talking about is really the sort of base state of the thing. The sort of foundation from which it emerges is one in which it should be the quiet room in which you begin to kind of assemble, you know, your rich worlds. And I think this is actually something that I was discussing in Urbit community in the design channel, but I think that one of the strong mistakes that a lot of calm computing forward projects take is this idea that calm or being quiet or being sort of introspective or even like endothermic as a sort of way of talking about how energy is directed is the only way to be. And if we assess the vast range of human activity, like sports is a perfect example of something that I see as very wholesome, very crucial to like the act of being a person, an active human being moving around in the world. And just being able to kind of like, have energy be released in that sort of like exothermic way is a way that I would describe it. I think that that's fine. Like that's totally cool. And I think it kind of hurts the sort of totality of what being a person on a computer could be if the only way that we enforced being a human on a computer is to be a calm person, stay in that quiet little box, and that's the only way in which you can interface with computers. I don't think that's at all the sort of claim or sort of vector that we're claiming computers should take. But I think that we are just like offering the option that could be like the base experience, and you could add on that sort of notion of a more sort of excited state elsewhere in the system, and maybe even have that be isolated in the form of a group. As long as I think the mechanisms that we kind of offer up are not ones that I think are conducive towards the mining of dopamine, such as I think likes are the constants of a battleground for that. The idea of sort of like sharing, I think retweeting or reblogging or whatever the verb you use for that is also seen as a sort of constant state of tension as to whether or not this encourages unhealthy behavior. As long as I think those mechanisms are very, very deeply like introspected, as long as I think we're deeply strategic around the actual deployment of interfaces like that in Landscape specifically, I think that introducing something like a streaming interface with chat won't be the most unhealthy thing one could possibly release with respect to Landscape. It's a question that is worth deeper consideration, though, that I think we all are aware that these can all too quickly turn into very negative experiences.
Thank you. That's a good answer.
Anybody else?
Here.
Okay, well, just a couple quick announcements then. So this Friday at I believe is it 5 p.m. Pacific or is it 6 p.m. Pacific? Is the event that Ed has been alluding to, which is, and you can find this by going to meetup.com and just searching for Urbit SF San Francisco, and then you can sign up for that event. You'll get a notification and a link and how to share, how to join that when it does launch this Friday. It'll be sort of like a walkthrough of the current, a lot of these things that Ed has been talking about. Also, in the link of this description of this video that I'll be putting up will be a special code for anybody who's watching the Dalten Collective videos to sign up for Talon's hosting service. We'll have a special attribution link, which will help bump you up to that top of that list. So that'll be in the link to this description. So those two things. And with that, again, Ed, thank you very much, and we'll see you on Urbit.
Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, let me know. You can contact me in Urbit whenever.